Welcome back. Last month, I picked for my September book club the book Roman Stories by Jhumpa Lahiri, and I thought I'd take the opportunity to share a little bit more about the book, deepen the discussion, and kind of complete the cycle of updating all of you with the book and give some final thoughts around it. Just a quick reminder to everyone, if you enjoy this content, don't forget to follow. I think my first stop is to talk about the author, Jhumpa Lahiri, because she's a pretty interesting person with a pretty interesting career and some pretty powerful themes throughout her work. She was born in the late 60s in London. Her parents immigrated to the US when she was like 3 years old. So she's very much an American writer. Her parents were originally immigrants from West Bengal in India. And that's actually the first thing to consider, because that origin story does reverberate throughout her work. Westerners tend to look at India as kind of a very unitary, monolithic country, and that's kind of a mistake. I was lucky enough to live and work in India for a couple of years, so I got a close-up look at the place and understood that actually it's a very diversified place, lots of different states that have their different languages, different foods, different cultures and traditions. And so it's very, very diverse. And West Bengal, where Jhumpa Lahiri's family is from, has a very powerful identity. It has a very powerful language, very good food. The capital is Kolkata, as it's now known. I spent quite a bit of time there and got a real sense that it was operating in a different cultural and economic landscape than the rest of India, like, say, Mumbai or Delhi. So her parents came from there. They immigrated to the US. And that sense of being an immigrant in America, coming from a family with very different, very powerful traditions, resonated very much with Jhumpa Lahiri. In fact, her first name is not Jhumpa. Her first name is Nilanjana Sudeshna Lahiri. And as is typical to a lot of foreign kids in America who get their names mangled, she had to kind of come up with a family nickname that was easier to digest. And she has recalled this in past interviews, saying that that was kind of the first time she felt her fundamental identity being assaulted, let's say, by this new world in which she lived. She first burst onto the literary scene with her first book called The Interpreter of Maladies, which was a short story collection, and it won the Pulitzer Prize, and it got everybody very excited. And it was a collection of short stories that revolved, a bit like a concept album, that revolved around the theme of immigrants with very strong cultures navigating a new world. And that's something that has come back in her later works, like her novels, The Namesake, which came out, I think, in 2003, and The Lowland, which came out about 10 years ago. And these all deal with this theme of immigrants dealing with how to keep their traditions and their culture alive for themselves while assimilating and fitting in as best they can into these new worlds. And that's clearly a struggle that has been part of Jhumpa Lahiri's life, and that has been the raw material and fed her inspiration as an artist to write books around that topic. So that's a pretty successful trajectory for any given author to publish these very successful books and so on. But her career took a really interesting turn in 2012 because she moved to Rome. Her husband is a senior editor at Time, and I guess his job took him to Rome, and she moved there with him. And fair play to this lady for deciding to learn the language and deciding to write in the language. I mean, I find this a hugely tall order. but she went through it, and she started publishing nonfiction at first. Then she published a first Italian novel called Dove mi trovo. It was translated into English as Whereabouts. And then last year she published Roman Stories, and that was a collection of short stories. So it was back to her, let's say, her fundamental form. I think many authors have a kind of preference as to what form they like, and her origin as an author seems to be with the short story. So it's back to that form. And this is the book we picked. So she wrote this book in Italian, and she translated a few of the stories and had a professional translator translate the rest of the stories. And we'll come back to it in a second. In the meantime, she also went back to academia. She was a professor at Princeton for 6 or 7 years, and now she's back at Columbia, where she actually studied, at Barnard College, to be more precise, where she's a professor of English and creative writing. So now we know all that background. Let's have a look at Roman Stories. And based on that knowledge of her biography, the book makes a lot of sense. It's a collection of short stories that very much looks at Rome not as a physical space, but rather as a place where people are contemplating their role, their existence almost. And there's always a sense that that existence contains an element of being an outsider. Whether it's a migrant or an expat or a tourist, basically somebody who doesn't quite belong to the fundamental fabric of Rome and is having some sort of experience in this Roman universe. And again, Rome barely features in this. There's no mention of like a cute store in Rome or a great bakery or a pizzeria. There's no sense of any kind of magic to do with Rome or its long history. I mean, this collection of short stories could have taken place in Liverpool for all that Rome is involved in. It really is not so present. And yet, there is one element that is present, and that is a certain indifference that escalates to active misunderstanding, that escalates to aggression towards people who are not of this Roman fabric, of the historic legacy of Rome. And this tells me that there's something quite political about this collection of short stories. This is, I think, a message from Jhumpa Lahiri to Italian society that recent developments in Italy, both social and political developments, are not great. And I'm talking obviously about there have been big waves of immigration to Italy, big waves of migrants arriving in Italy. That has fueled a lot of xenophobic sentiment in Italy, which is already not the most, let's say, woke or tolerant place in the world. And I say this with the greatest respect for Italy and Italians, but Italy is not as advanced as, say, North American or Northern European countries in terms of its analysis of integration of immigrants into its social fabric. And I think that's reflected by the growing vote toward xenophobic far-right parties and their eventual victory to form a government, and that is the government of Giorgia Meloni, who is now the prime minister of Italy, who was elected on a very anti-migrant perspective. So clearly the discourse in Italy has become more intense towards immigration, towards migrants. And for a brown woman like Jhumpa Lahiri, that escalation in the climate must have revived a lot of pretty powerful emotions that she probably thought she had put behind her in the US and that were very much revived in Italy. I'm guessing. I have no idea. I haven't spoken to her, but this would be my speculation. Again, I say this with the greatest respect for Italy and Italians, but it's a place where, not so long ago, the Prime Minister, Silvio Berlusconi, was making gaffes. I mean, really misplaced comments about Obama having a nicer tan than he did. And that kind of stupid comment that's a little bit insensitive, that can find more voice in Italy than in other places like, say, the US or Canada. And so that clash of identity, of Jhumpa Lahiri's identity, in Italy would have been quite difficult. I can imagine, for example, in Italy and in many places in Europe, people asking her where she's from. She might reply, "I'm American," and people replying, "No, but where are you really from?" And in North America today, obviously, people have moved past that kind of question. If somebody says they're American, it doesn't matter what they look like, they're American, and people don't really delve much more deeply than that. In Europe, that's still very much a reflex, and in Italy, it's fundamental. People have quite ethnocentric views of who belongs and who doesn't belong. So I'm guessing, without getting too political about the whole thing, I'm guessing that she must have experienced these kind of moments quite regularly in Italy, and that, I think, was the raw material for those stories. That political element I would call very much a background set in those stories. It's definitely not central. Some of the stories do evoke aggression towards foreigners more actively than others, but some of the stories are more subtle about it. They're all very anonymous in that it feels that her comment, the symbolism she's trying to convey here, is that it doesn't really matter who you are, where you're from, or whatever. This misunderstanding that can often border on what feels like aggression, it doesn't matter where you're from. It connects, it hurts in the same way, no matter where you come from. And again, just to repeat myself, that vibe has so much to do with this experience of otherness. And this experience of otherness can probably be connected to loneliness. A lot of the characters in these stories feel lonely or are dealing with a struggle to connect to others with whom they might have been close, or some of whom they fantasize they would like to be close to. I'm thinking of the short story I think it's the second story in the book, where this author is fantasizing about, potentially being in love with a woman he's met so briefly at a party in Rome. And so there's a lot of that sense of, isolation and loneliness, and how that's probably got to be a very important component of the experience of being, not just a tourist, but a migrant, an immigrant, an expat, discovering a new place. And it's something that probably was fairly present in Jhumpa Lahiri's life when she moved to Rome and felt a bit isolated by a culture that isn't so well equipped to deal with people who look like her. There's something a little bit also like fables to the story. You sense that there's a moral point to it, not so much in the plot dynamics, but more in the atmosphere that is conveyed. And it's no coincidence, I think, that the title of the book is connected. In Italian, it was called Racconti Romani, Roman tales, let's say. And there was previously a book by the great author Alberto Moravia, an Italian author, who wrote things like great books in the 40s and 50s. He was an anti-fascist author. Great books like Contempt, that was adapted by Godard, Jean-Luc Godard, into a great movie with Brigitte Bardot, I think. And then he also wrote the book The Conformist. It was made into a great movie by Bernardo Bertolucci. And so this author, Alberto Moravia, he had published a book with the same name, Racconti Romani, that was kind of a set of fables around Rome. I haven't read it, so I can't really comment, but I get the feeling that, yeah, it's those things are connected. These are Roman tales, but ironically, of course, not much connects to the Roman origins. One exception might be one of the stories is called Dante Alighieri, and has very much a lot of references to Dante, to purgatory, to a journey of a character, again anonymous, in her life, and you know, that mirrors Dante's great work, The Divine Comedy. That sense of anonymity, and also of being quite detached from the city in the title, also evokes another book, which I have read, called Paris Stories by Mavis Gallant. Mavis Gallant was a Canadian writer who was, I think, mostly based in Paris. She was a freelance writer, but most of her work ended up in the New Yorker magazine somehow. So I'm not sure exactly whether she was a staff writer of the New Yorker or more of a freelancer, but essentially she had a very close collaboration with the New Yorker, based in Paris. So she was a writer, American writer in post-war Paris for the New Yorker. And so there's that certain element of this post-war, this glorious time in Paris, quite glamorous, quite swinging, slightly otherworldly compared to where we live today. Maybe a simpler time, where problems were maybe below some sort of veneer, for sure. But again, Paris Stories, like Roman Stories, the book we're discussing today, is very much not about plot, not about characters, definitely not about place. It's about vibe. And this book, Roman Stories, is about vibes. And clearly a lot of the vibes are about interacting with others, foreigners, people not like us. And if you've seen the movie French Dispatch by Wes Anderson, Mavis Gallant is loosely portrayed in that movie by Frances McDormand in the segment with Timothée Chalamet. She's of that era. And I'm pretty sure that there's a connection, an inspiration of sorts also with Paris Stories, these short stories that are of no time, of no place, and about nobody. They're just about a vibe. And I thought that was pretty powerful. I think those are my main points for this recap of this book club and that review. I hope many of you were able to read the book. I really recommended it. I thought it was a really powerful book, easy to read, fairly short, but also very fluid prose. That weirdly didn't feel translated. And I guess that's because she had a hand in translating her own material from Italian into English. So it felt fairly fluid. And certainly I would recommend it to anyone, certainly anybody visiting Rome. I think it's very appropriate reading. But anyone who's interested in these themes of otherness and loneliness. Again, just to remind you, it's not about plot. There's no massive twists in these stories. It's not about characters. They're mostly anonymous, well crafted, well drawn, but anonymous. And so, yeah, I really recommend this. I hope everybody enjoyed it as much as I did. And I'll be back at the end of this month for an in-depth review of the October pick for the book club, which was Intermezzo by Sally Rooney. It's just come out. It's her fourth novel, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot of very interesting points to discuss around this. I'll update everyone with a nice long video at the end of this month. Hope everyone's well, and in the meantime, keep reading. If you enjoy this content in general, please don't forget to follow. And if you're looking for more great weekly content, you can sign up to my Substack newsletter. The link is in the description. And that's a great way to stay up to date with great literary news, reviews, recommendations, and so on. Hope everyone's well. In the meantime, keep reading. Thanks a lot. Bye.